There was a young girl somewhere in Israel who grew up in a secular family, but she heard that there is such a thing as lighting Shabbat candles. She asked her mother, do we light Shabbat candles? The mother said, we don't light Shabbat candles. The girl was determined. Maybe she heard about it in grade school. And so the story goes that she went to the local makolet and she asked the proprietor to sell her some candles. She was a little girl, second grade, third grade. What do you need them for? The storekeeper asked. She said, I need to light the candles. You know, the candles. So he said, look, we don't have candles here. And then he remembered that he did have a few candles in the store. Comes back from the back room, but all he had were 2 yurtzeit candles. And he sold this little girl, paid with her shkalim for these 2 yurtzeit candles. And she came back home. And indeed, when she arrived back home, she lit the candles in her room. And when she lit these candles, she, I guess, knew how to make the bracha or whatever it is. And she discovered as she was reciting whatever bracha she knew, that her door to her bedroom was opening at that very moment. And there was her mother standing aghast. And she asked her, what are you doing? And the little girl turned to her and she said, Al tidagi ima, echad le'aba, ve'echad le'ima. You had 2 candles, one for the Abba and one for the Ima. And the mother was, of course, ashen-faced. And I don't know if this story is true, but I've heard it in many different guises. Of course, the story has a happy ending. The mother decided from then on, I better light Shabbat candles. Sometimes things happen that shake us up, and we think in a different way about something that we've had all along. And I'm holding in my hand an article that is almost a year old. I've kept it in a file since last year. I can't help myself. It was from the Wall Street Journal on March the 26th. So we're almost at the 1-year anniversary. In fact, in the Hebrew dates, we're even closer. It was an opinion piece called A Coronavirus Great Awakening, ? Sometimes the most important ingredient for spiritual renewal is a cataclysmic event. Writes Robert Nicholson. Who is he? He's the president of the Philos Project. Got me no closer to understanding who the man is. And he asked, could a plague of biblical proportions be America's best hope for religious revival? As the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II approaches, there is reason to think so. 3/4 of a century has dimmed the memory of that gruesome conflict and its terrible consequences. Tens of millions killed, great cities bombed to rubble, Europe and Asia stricken by hunger and poverty. Those who survived the war had to grapple with the kinds of profound questions that only arise in the aftermath of calamity. Gazing at the ruins from his window at Cambridge University, the British historian Herbert Butterfield chose to make sense of it by turning to the Hebrew Bible. And Butterfield wrote, quote, the power of the Old Testament teaching on history, perhaps the point at which the ancient Jews were most original, breaking away from the religious thought of the other peoples around them, lay precisely in the region of truths which sprang from a reflection on catastrophe and cataclysm. It is almost impossible properly to appreciate the higher developments in the historical reflection of the Old Testament, except in another age, which has experienced or has found itself confronted with colossal cataclysm. Now, this article was written, I remind you, a year ago, when the death toll was not as high as it is now, when our lives had only momentarily been upended and for seemingly torn away from the way we had known it until that point. Now we're a year later. Further in the same article, quoting also from Butterfield again, quotes from a lot in this opinion piece. He says that sheer grimness of suffering brings men sometimes into profounder understanding of human destiny. Sometimes it is only by a cataclysm that man can make his escape from the net, which he has taken so much trouble to weave around himself. And here we are, a year hence, and we ought to ask, was there a coronavirus great awakening? Parshat Tisa was the last Torah portion that was read at Congregation Or Torah, and then there was a break until Parshat Korach. Not one parak, not one pasuk was read in the shul, and everyone was suddenly at home and trying to stay together and try to stay healthy. even as we were socially distanced and feeling, obviously, the weight of the stress of uncertainty and the like. And here we are a year later. And as we turn to Parshat Tisa again, there are many different stories about cataclysm, like the Cheta Egel, and the reprieve, and then the forgiveness that has given the great things that came from that crisis, and the missteps, and the terrible nadir that Jewish history fell into was soon recovered and repaired and found new vistas. That's certainly true. But I want to turn to something that on the face of it sounds a lot more prosaic, and to ask the question pointedly, how are we doing with this? You see, in the middle of the Parsha, really just on the precipice of the abyss that would be the Cheta Egel, comes the following instruction. It's really the last lines before we learned that the people thought that they didn't see Moshe. He was tarrying, he wasn't coming back, and therefore they built a golden calf. We know the rest of the story. Unfortunately, it is our story. The last section, the last Parsha in the Chumash, the last paragraph in the Sefer Torah, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor, ve'ata daber el bnei Yisrael lemor, ach et shabtotai tishmoru. Ki ot hi beini uvenichem l'dorotechem ladat, ki ani Hashem mekadishchem. And you will speak to the children of Israel, and saying, yet you shall keep my Shabbatot, in the plural, for it is a sign between me, says God, and you, the Jewish people, for all generations, to know that I am Hashem who sanctifies you. Ushmartim et Shabbat, ki kodesh yilachem, etc., etc. That's a 6-verse section. But after the first few verses, we get to the part that we all know and say every single Shabbat, Friday night and Shabbat morning. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, lasot et ha-Shabbat l'dorotam brit olam. We know how this goes. These psukim, Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael ot hi le'olam, ki shesh yamim asa Hashem et ha-shamayim v'ha'aretz, uv'yom hashvi shavat vayinafash. It's in the tefillah on Friday night in the Beit Knesset, before the Amidah. It's Shabbat morning in the Amidah. It's the section of the Torah that are the psukim in Shacharit. Many of us recite it at Kiddush as well. The covenant between us and Hashem. Shabbat, almost right there on the edge of the cliff, reminding us before the moment of falling that actually we do have this anchor. And more than an anchor, we have this covenant that is unshakable and unbreakable, if only we keep it. Rabbi Natan Omer in the Yalkut Shimoni, Minayin ata Omer, kol mi shemishamer at Shabbat ketikuna, malin alav ki ilu shamar kol Shabbatot. Rabbi Natan teaches, where do we know that anyone who keeps Shabbat properly, it is as if they have kept all of the Shabbatot. What does all the Shabbatot mean? He explicates. Miyom shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu olamo, from the moment that God has created the world, ad sheyichayu hametim, until the dead will live again. Because the Torah says, V'shamru b'nei Yisrael. The Kli Yakar wondered, how did Rabbi Natan come up with this? It seems strange. And he explained the following. He said, in this little section, we learn first about the notion of the Shabbatot, ach et Shabtotai tishmoru, in the plural Shabbatot. Said the Kli Yakar, number one, it is Shabbat, of course, reminds of Chidush HaOlam, about the notion of the creation of the world. But also, every Shabbat, we're meant to have a vista to the future. The Shabbat of the future that teaches us about Olam Haba, about the Yom Shekulo Shabbat, the time that comes after time. I started thinking about the notion of the two candles, not only as Zachor v'Shamor, but the minimum of two candles, almost as the two signals, one to the other, the light from the beginning and the light from the end. And we are tethered in between those two lights. The Kli Yakar explains that the fact that it opens with the word Shabtotai, you shall keep and guard, protect my Shabbatot, for this is a sign between God and the Jewish people, then segues into the notion of the Yom HaShabbat mentioned in the first half, Sheish Yamim Niyasam Lacha Uvim Shvi Shabbat Shabbaton Kodesh LaHashem Kol HaOsem Lacha Biyom HaShabbat Mot Yumat, and then B'Shem B'nei Yisrael Et HaShabbat. Says the Kli Yakar, you know what the Shabtotai are, the two Shabbatot that every Jew is meant to keep, every single Shabbat? The Shabbat that reflects what happened at the beginning, and the Shabbat that projects what will happen at the end, and to recognize that we live within that continuum, and to see, I would submit, all of the experiences that we have as part and parcel of that continuum, to have that sense of perspective, and to affirm that we are part of that continuum by protecting the Shabbat, by making sure that Shabbat is not just another day of the week. And so often, so many of us perhaps fell into other habits regarding Shabbat, but not during COVID, because for so many of us, we rediscovered during this period of time, hopefully we discovered, and we're still discovering, the beauty of Shabbat. The notion that Shabbat really is an island in time. If you can hark back to the beginning portion of this pandemic, I can say personally, I felt assaulted by the media onslaught and by my connectivity to what was going on elsewhere in the world, where terrible things were happening, whether it was China or Italy or places in the United States, or even within our own community. And just to have one day where we were able to push away all of that and to have an island in time, as it's sometimes been called. But here, it turns out that in Parshat Tisa, before the crisis, before the cataclysm, comes the recognition that we actually are meant to continually ground ourselves in this covenant with Hashem. And indeed, that's what it means. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael oti le'olam. It is not just that it's a covenant that is called the Brit Olam, but it's a sign for all time, from the beginning until the end. As the Yalkut Shimoni writes elsewhere in Parshat Balotcha, Im shamartam neirot shel Shabbat, if you guard the lights of Shabbat, ani mar'eh lachem neirot shel Tzion, I will show you eventually the lights of Zion. May I ask you, the Yalkut Shimoni is a very, very, very old work of Medrash. Can you imagine if you would have asked someone from 200 years ago, you know that there are all these Jews who keep Shabbos, and it's becoming decreasingly popular to do so with the advent of modernity. If we keep going with it, you'll see someday we'll see the Neirot Shel Tzion. We don't see the Neirot of Tzion yet of redemption, but we certainly see the Neirot of Tzion, at least the beginnings of the Neirot of Tzion. And we feel, I think, many of us, a great sense of pain and anguish now at how disconnected we are, our inability to get to Eretz Yisrael, most of us now, and the inability of people from Eretz Yisrael to communicate with us, at least physically. They do so virtually, of course, but that has also been a feature of this. Im shamartem neirot shel Shabbat. If we're able to guard, what does it mean, the lights of Shabbat now? I think it means what the Kli Yakar says it means, based on this Medrash of Rabbi Natan, that it's the beginning and it's the end, and to recognize this is all part of an unfolding process, and to take not just solace, but also strength from it. But here's the part that depends on us. How are we doing with our Shmirat Shabbat? You know, there's always new things that we can do to learn in order to keep Shabbat a little bit better. Imagine if we had a conference that we organized once a year, where we said during this conference, we're going to study Torah. We have this conference, we call it Shavuot. It's a 2-day period we learn Torah. But as it turns out, as an example, the day of Shabbat is a prime time to expand one's Judaism. And we live at a time when one can literally, not figuratively, literally bring into their home on a Friday a sheaf of papers about Yed High, which can either be about politics and sports and about all sorts of things, or it can actually be enriching ideas of Torah and spirituality and bringing Shabbat into our lives more and more. None of us really, I think, can identify with that story with a little girl who's lighting Shabbat candles with yurtzeit candles to shake up the mother to realize, hey, if we don't keep Shabbos, what's going to happen to the Jewish people? And it depends on us and each one of our families. So I want to close with a little story just to think about it maybe in a little bit of a different way. You've all heard of the Bering Strait and the Bering Sea. Today it's the Bering Sea, between Alaska and the outer reaches of northern Russia. You know that there are islands that come off of Alaska. They're called the Aleutian Islands. So it was that Chabad once sent 2 boys, Bachrim, to go to the Aleutian Islands to go see if there are any Jews there. And after a week of searching, they found nobody. So they finally go to a little classroom of grade school children, and they asked the teacher, can we make a cultural announcement? So, yeah, okay. And they announced, is anybody in this classroom Jewish? And the teacher blurts out, no, nobody's Jewish here. And a little girl from the back of the class raises her hand. Mommy, does this mean that we're really not Jewish? This little girl in the back of the classroom was actually the daughter of the teacher. It's Aleutian Islands. I guess it's, they don't have all that much by way of classroom separation between the parents and the children. The mother was teaching her daughter among the pupils. So the class ended. The Bachrim sat down with the mother and the daughter. They're trying to tell them about Judaism. And the mother asks that there's a whole family story, not for now, but the mother asks these Bachrim, please give my daughter some encouragement. So one of the Bachrim says to the little girl as follows. So, every Friday, when it's time for the sun to set in Australia, they light the Shabbat candles. But actually in Israel, they haven't lit the Shabbat candles yet. In a few hours later, it's time in Israel to light the Shabbat candles. Then it's time in Paris, France. And someone has to light the Shabbat candles in Paris. And then it goes over the ocean. After it goes through Great Britain, it goes all the way over the ocean. And people in New York City, and then people in Chicago, and then people in California, they all light the Shabbat candles. And then nobody's left in the world to light Shabbat candles except the last place on earth, the farthest west point until we get to the date line where the sun will set last on a Friday, is in the Aleutian Islands. And they said to her, Stacy, when you will, from now on, if you will light the Shabbat candles, you agree to do this, you will complete the circle of all of the Jewish people throughout the world who are all keeping Shabbat. Would you do that for the Jewish people? And Stacy said, I agree. We're all part of that circle. And of course, a circle does not actually have a beginning or an end. But we're also in that line between the one candle and the other candle. Our lighting of Shabbat candles is no mere exercise in just the onset of the day. It's a declaration that there is a beginning and there is an end, and we are part of that system. Whether this has been the great religious awakening that will have long-standing impact, I hope so. I think we all hope so, that people will come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a result. But even through it all, and even until it will finish, we need to redouble our efforts to keep Shabbos, to have respect for Shabbos. It takes very practical approach in terms of not doing malacha, but also a certain mindset. But what it means to be a shomer Shabbat. Each of us completes that circle each week with our lighting of the Shabbat candles and our guarding the Shabbat and the message of Shabbat, that God is in the world and God is in our lives. I wish everyone an Erev Shabbat Shalom, and I look forward to seeing you soon again on a broadcast like this, or maybe even in shul when the time is right. Shabbat Shalom.